Somewhere, at some point, long before anyone wrote anything down, a human being picked up a burning plant, breathed in the smoke on purpose, and decided they liked it. That single moment might be one of the oldest deliberate choices in our entire species' history. Older than farming, older than writing, quite possibly older than most of what we'd call civilization. That sounds like an exaggeration. It isn't. Let's start with the obvious question. What were early humans even smoking? Long before tobacco as we know it, there's archaeological evidence that humans across different continents were burning and inhaling all kinds of plants, not always for pleasure and not always the way we think of smoking today. Some of it was almost certainly accidental at first. Fire itself produces smoke, and any hunter-gatherer sitting close enough to a fire pit, especially one burning resinous wood or certain wild herbs, was already inhaling plant compounds without trying to. But deliberate, intentional smoking, picking a specific plant because of what it did to you, is a different story, and it appears to go back much further than most people assume. The clearest, best documented evidence comes from the Americas. Archaeologists working at a site called the Wishbone site in Utah found charred tobacco seeds inside a stone pipe dating back roughly 12,300 years. That's not a typo. 12,300 years ago, deep in the last ice age, someone was already smoking tobacco through a purpose-built tool. For context, that predates the invention of writing by more than 7,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by nearly 10,000 years. Agriculture itself, the domestication of wheat and rice, and the beginning of permanent farming villages was still thousands of years away. Whoever that person was, they weren't part of an agricultural society, weren't part of any city, weren't part of what most of us picture when we think civilization at all. They were hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, and somewhere along the way, they'd already figured out how to cultivate a relationship with a psychoactive plant specifically for its effects. So why would a hunter-gatherer bother? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the earliest use of tobacco almost certainly wasn't recreational in the way we think of a cigarette today. Across nearly every documented indigenous culture in the Americas where tobacco use has been studied, the plant shows up first and foremost in a ritual, medicinal, and spiritual context, not a casual one. Tobacco in high enough doses is genuinely psychoactive, capable of producing altered states of consciousness, visions, and intense physical sensations. Many indigenous traditions use tobacco specifically to reach these altered states deliberately, as part of healing ceremonies, communication with spirits, or rites of passage. Shamans and healers across dozens of distinct cultures, from the Amazon basin to North America, used concentrated tobacco preparations as a tool to enter trance states, not unlike how other cultures independently discovered other psychoactive plants for similar spiritual purposes. This wasn't a fringe or marginal practice either. Tobacco became deeply embedded in nearly every major indigenous culture across 2 entire continents, appearing in origin, myths, creation stories, and treaty ceremonies. Among many Native American nations, tobacco was considered sacred, a gift meant to be treated with respect, not casually consumed the way it eventually would be after European contact. Smoking a pipe together wasn't just a habit. It was often a binding social and spiritual act, sealing agreements, honoring guests, or marking significant moments in a person's life. The famous peace pipe that shows up, often badly caricatured in old Western movies, is a real and much more nuanced practice. A ceremonial pipe used in specific, meaningful contexts to formalize agreements and honor relationships between people or nations. It was never meant to be an everyday, casual habit, which makes what happened next a genuinely strange historical turn. When European explorers arrived in the Americas starting in the late 15th century, they encountered tobacco use almost immediately, and they were fascinated by it. Christopher Columbus's crew recorded seeing indigenous people smoking rolled leaves as early as 1492. Within just a few decades, tobacco had been carried back across the Atlantic, and Europe developed what can only be described as an obsession. But something crucial got lost in that transmission. The deep ritual, ceremonial, controlled context that had shaped tobacco use for thousands of years in the Americas simply didn't survive the crossing. Europeans adopted the plant, but almost none of the cultural framework around it. What had been a sacred, occasional, ceremonially significant substance became, within just a couple of generations, a casual daily commodity, something to smoke constantly, recreationally for its own sake, disconnected entirely from the spiritual and communal meaning it once carried. This is where the story stops being about ancient smoke and starts being about us. We tend to assume that when a practice becomes a habit, its meaning stays roughly the same, just repeated more often. The history of tobacco shows the opposite can happen. The exact same physical act, inhaling burning plant matter, carried almost completely different meanings depending entirely on the culture and context surrounding it. For 12,000 years in its place of origin, tobacco was rare, deliberate, and heavily loaded with spiritual significance. Within a few hundred years of being uprooted from that context, it became one of the most common, casual, and eventually one of the most dangerous daily habits in human history. Nothing about the plant itself changed. What changed was the container of meaning around it, and once that container broke, the substance kept moving forward without the safeguards, rituals, and cultural limits that had shaped its use for millennia beforehand. It's a pattern worth sitting with. A practice doesn't need to be invented from nothing to become genuinely dangerous. Sometimes it just needs to be taken out of the context that used to keep it in check. So the next time you think about how old smoking really is, don't just think about cigarette packaging from the last century or Hollywood images of smoke curling in black and white films. Think about a hunter-gatherer, deep in the last ice age, more than 12,000 years ago, carefully lighting a stone pipe, thousands of years before the first city, the first written word, or the first farmed field. That single act, repeated and reshaped across 12 millennia, eventually became one of the most widespread and consequential habits our species has ever carried with it. Sources referenced in this video are noted in the description.